So now I want to walk you through the expectations for this assignment, and then I will go through each of the 3 hypotheses. So this module product is to help you to think more about stress and coping, but also to be very careful that you are providing real information, so real scientific facts that support what you are saying. This can be pulled from your textbook and also from articles that you can find, some primary resources, so research that has been done that you're hearing straight from the authors who conducted the research, not secondary sources. So I've provided you with a table to help you out so you can clearly, as you're listening to me, answer these questions of what does our data say. We have 200 students that we've been able to collect over the past 3 semesters of offering this class, so we have a really nice sample size. And then I've also provided here where you can jot down some notes when you're reading back through the stress and coping chapters to sort of support why do you think we found this in our population, or why don't you think our hypothesis was supported? Please be sure you're looking at the rubric so you know exactly what we expect. We expect at least 2 primary sources, so you're going to find at least 2 articles to pull in. You need to provide at least a 5-paragraph paper. The introduction will have you outlining at least 1 major model of stress and why it's important to investigate stress for university students. For the second paragraph, you need to cover hypothesis 1. The 3rd paragraph, hypothesis 2, the 4th paragraph, hypothesis 3, and then finally a conclusion section where you are explaining why some of the hypotheses didn't turn out, why they did, what are some critiques you have of the measures used, and a discussion of significant life events, daily hassles, and perceived stress. There is not a bonus option for this semester. So let's get started. I'm using our data set, and first let's just sort of look at some of the demographics for this final data. For example, in terms of age, we have our mode is 22, so most people taking the surveys are 22, with a range between 18 and 65 years. In terms of gender, we have predominantly female, 138 women, and these are the kind of things you can think about when you're answering in the conclusion paragraph why you think our results are the way they are, because this gives you an example of who we can generalize this to. We have just a very small sample of sophomores, mainly seniors taking this course. And in fact, we have about a quarter are graduating this semester. In terms of the number of classes, we can see that on average, people are taking around 4 classes, but some people are taking up to 7 classes. And you can see how it's clustered right around here in the middle between 3 to 5 classes. And then finally, let's see how much people are working. So we see on average people are working part-time. We have a good chunk who are not working at the moment. And then let's scroll down. You can see that we have some people who are definitely working full-time if you look down at the bottom. Okay, so that gives us an idea of what our sample looks like. Now let's run our syntax for our hypotheses. The first hypothesis, people who are older and further along in their college career have more responsibilities and tasks and therefore have higher stress. So first we're going to do a simple correlation with this, and then we're going to look at t-tests. Let me remind you about these types of analyses. So first, when we look at a correlation, you need to remember that a correlation, we need to consider both direction and magnitude. So direction, you can have a negative or a positive correlation. If it's a negative correlation, it means that when you are higher on one variable, you're seeing a lower relationship for the other variables. So for example, here you can see we have a negative relationship with age and perceived stress. So when people are higher on age, when they're older, they have lower stress. Now this is significant, that says 0.002. As long as it's less than 0.05, then we consider it a significant relationship. And this is in the opposite direction of what hypothesis is, because we hypothesize we'd have a positive correlation, that with the higher the age, the more perceived stress, but it's actually in the opposite direction. We also can talk about in correlation the magnitude of the correlation. The higher the correlation, the stronger the relationship between two variables. Now, a correlation has to be between -1 and +1. So if you're ever doing a correlation by hand and you get 2, you know you did something wrong. But this is a good example of magnitude. This is actually a pretty high magnitude for the relationship between our undergraduate stress questionnaire and our perceived stress questionnaire. And what that means is that we have a pretty strong relationship between the number of events a person goes through and their perception of their stress. And why I say that's pretty high is because, of course, a perfect correlation would be 1, but in psychology, we have so many variables that can explain an outcome. So it's not often that we would have a variable of as high, or correlation as high of magnitude as 1. Now, a t-test is when you're comparing two groups. So that means one of your variables has to be a dichotomous variable. So a variable that you can split into two. And I ran some syntax to collapse sophomores and juniors together to compare them to seniors, so that we have two groups. We have seniors compared to younger individuals. Now, to walk you through what all this means, your N is how many are in each group. So we have 69 sophomores and juniors, 86 seniors. This is the average they had for the perceived stress score. And you can see they're pretty close. The standard deviations are also very similar. And when you look down here, you can see that our t-test is 1.5. It is not significant because this is greater than 0.05. So we do not see a significant difference between sophomores and juniors and seniors on their perceived stress. We see a similar result here. The t-test is 0.76. It is not significant. That is greater than 0.05. So for the undergraduate stress questionnaire, the number of stress events that they were going through, they have very similar means and standard deviations, and this is not significant. So overall for hypothesis 1, we can say that we did not support that older students had higher stress when we looked using t-tests, and in fact we didn't support the hypothesis, and it was in the opposite direction when we looked at the correlation between age and perceived stress. For the undergraduate stress questionnaire, that was a non-significant correlation. So there's your answer for hypothesis 1. You can also find the output on Blackboard, so you can look through it, and I've highlighted important numbers for you. Let's move on to hypothesis 2. So for that, we think that people who are more optimistic and use humor more will have lower perceived stress and better coping. So you read about this in your textbook. So let's see if that was also found in our class. Now, this is a correlation matrix, and this looks very overwhelming. But what I've done is I've made it where you only have to look at these first two columns. And in fact, when I save this to Blackboard, you will only see these two columns, so you don't have to be overwhelmed by all of this. But just to help you see a correlation matrix, you're going to see that it's repetitive, that this top triangle is going to be same at the bottom triangle. So look, these are the same, and these are the same, and these are the same. So we are interested in, do people with higher perceived stress, are these the less optimistic people? And sure enough, look at this nice magnitude and a negative correlation, and it's significant. It's less than 0.001. So this is saying that people who are higher on optimism have lower perceived stress. This is a negative correlation. You could flip that around and also say people who are higher on stress have lower optimism. Now, you can look at these different ways of coping and be sure to refer back to remind yourself which ones are adaptive coping and which one are maladaptive. So planful problem solving is adaptive, and we see that people with higher planful problem solving have less perceived stress and they are more optimistic. Now, in contrast, avoidance coping is not a very good way of coping, and we see people who avoid more have higher perceived stress and also have lower optimism. I have provided these highlighted, the significant ones, so you can go through them for your write-up. Now let's look at humor. So the same thing, we're only going to have to look at these first two columns, so don't get overwhelmed by everything else. But you will see that people with higher humor have less perceived stress, and that is significant. When we look at the different ways of coping, let's use the same examples. Those with better, with an adaptive coping style, planful problem solving, they have less perceived stress and they are more likely to use humor. So you can see this is a negative correlation and this one is a positive correlation. Now when we look at escape avoidance, then we see that that is positively related to stress, but that is not related. It's a non-significant relationship with humor. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is seeking social support. And you'll see that seeking social support is negatively related to stress. So people who are higher on stress seek social support less, but it is positively related to humor. And you might think about how humor has a very social aspect. So there is your results for hypothesis 2. And the final hypothesis, the one that is very critical for health psychology, is how does all of this relate to health? So let's look at that. This physical symptoms checklist, so people who have higher scores are demonstrating more physical symptoms. And we see that people, there's a nice magnitude, people with higher stress are also showing greater physical symptoms. And look at this magnitude, almost 0.7 for the number of events that they have gone through. So these are very impressive and show that there is a definite relationship between physical symptoms and perceived stress and undergraduate stress. And then I've also looked at some maladaptive ways of coping and seen how they relate to physical symptoms. And you'll see that escape avoidance and accepting responsibility, both of these are positively related to more physical symptoms. They're also positively related to higher perceived stress and going through more stress events. So that gives you everything you need to complete the Module 2 assignment. Good luck!